Please join me in welcoming Alex Himelfarb.
Well, thank you, Gil, and I'm really impressed with I was asked if I had PowerPoint, and I hate PowerPoint, but what's even more important, Gil just delivered my speech, so I have kind of freedom now to talk about whatever the hell I want to talk about. So let me first say I'm delighted to be here wearing my AFL credentials in a room which I'm convinced represents the most powerful progressive movement in Canada that's going to lead us out of the wilderness. I say that only partly to get applause. I actually wrote an article for Alberta Views because I was committed to the belief that the revolution will start in Alberta. In part because of the kind of leadership. I noticed that it wasn't just AFL, but Friends of AFL on the agenda tomorrow, Parkland, and Friends of Medicare, and Public Interest Alberta, and many others. And it's a force to be reckoned with. It's going to change. It's going to change because of the power of your voice. It's also going to change because it has to change in Alberta because you've screwed things up so badly. So. I should mention as well that this is the fourth time in just a few months I've been back to Alberta, because where better to talk about the austerity hoax, the folly of unaffordable and unfair tax cuts. I mean, I lived in a couple of other provinces and in fact out of the country, and all of us were looking at Alberta's prosperity, its dynamic economy, with envy, with jealousy. So how is it possible that in this province, with this extraordinary prosperity, at least for a number of years, you actually deferred investments in key infrastructure like hospitals and schools, even as your enrollments were rising? How is that possible that you couldn't afford to fix your schools and to fix your hospitals and build your schools? How is it possible that inequality in this unbelievably wealthy province was growing faster than any other province, to the extent that income is so concentrated at the top that Alberta looks like the USA? And that is not what we want. How is it possible that we weren't able to salt away some resources to deal with the inevitable volatility of prices and to build the jobs of the future and the clean and green jobs of the future? How is it that Norway could do it and we couldn't? And we're roughly the same size, Alberta and Norway. How is it possible? The answer is not what your government's been telling you. Alberta does not have a spending problem. Well, let me rephrase that. Alberta does have a spending problem, a public spending problem. You spend too little. And you spend too little because the so-called Alberta tax advantage is the way you have squandered the real Alberta advantage, its people, its dynamism, and its natural bounty. So how did we get here? Well, I'm not going to talk about Alberta. I don't pretend to be an expert in Alberta. I do kind of love Alberta. But the tax story is bigger than Alberta. It's even bigger than Canada. So let me talk a little bit about how we got here. How in the world did tax become a four-letter word that you don't utter in polite society? How did tax and spend become a pejorative? I mean, think about that for a second. Oh, I was doing a labor course. By the way, I should mention, I'm spending more and more of my time in labor halls. Like I live now with unions. I guess it was Monday, I was doing a Queen's course for labor activists, and then on next Monday, I'm with Hassan and CLC with the union leaders, and then the week after that, I'm with PSAC as their keynote. I'm where you show me a union and I will be there, because this is the last place and the first place that we understand the value of solidarity, that we're stronger together, that we can take the future back, but only together. So how did we get here? I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here, as tax is a pejorative, and tax and spend. So, I was going to say, at this course I was giving, one of the students said, well, you just sound like a tax and spender. Yes, I'm a tax and spender. What do governments do? They tax, they spend, they regulate. So you could tax the poor to serve the rich, buy stealth jets, and regulate people but not corporations. That's the current agenda. Or you could tax the rich, tax the corporations, tax those who benefit most from our infrastructure, to help those who need it, build the future, and regulate on behalf of people and nature. So, and we have to stop running away from these. Are you a tax and spender? Yeah. I tax fairly, I spend wisely, and I regulate on behalf of people and nature. How about you? So how did tax become? I got carried away. How did tax become a four-letter word? How did tax and spend become a four-letter word? You can start the story anywhere, but I'm going to start the story in the 80s. The neoliberal counterrevolution, what some people like to call the neoliberal counterrevolution, market fundamentalism, ushered in by Reagan and Thatcher. The early 80s, late 70s was a time of economic stagnation, high inflation, and during periods of economic shock, some people are often open to an alternative way of thinking. The neoliberals, the market fundamentalists, seized the opportunity and sold hard an agenda that the goal, growth, fight inflation. That was a goal, clear and unequivocal. The means, let the market be free. Free the market from interference from government. The problem was too much government and too much union. Unions were driving up wage inflation. They were constraining the market. You know, you'll hear Jack Mintz and others talk about the importance of a flexible labor market. Do you know what flexible labor market means? Attack on wages, attack on collective bargaining, attack on workers' rights, right? So that was part of the agenda, and the other part of the agenda was get government out of the way. Now, these people weren't anarchists, they weren't libertarians even. They believed in a role for government, but that was to protect life, liberty, and property. Or to put it more cynically, the role of government was to protect the market and those who benefit most from it. But get government out of the way of social and economic development. Get government out of the way of trying to constrain and influence the market. And how do you do that? You squeeze its revenues. You cut taxes. Milton Friedman, who's one of the architects of this, said, I never met a tax I didn't hate. Whenever government tries to do anything, they make things worse. We've got to get government out of the way. That was the line. Now, they had a problem trying to sell this, because in the post-war decades, people had come to love the public services, the quality of infrastructure, the access to health care, the access to education. So this represented the beginning of what I think of as the great tax cut hoax. The great tax cut hoax. The line that tax cuts are a free good, that we can cut taxes and we pay no penalty. There are no consequences. How do they sell this? The first line to sell this, a line they used in the 80s, I don't know how many of you have heard of the Laffer curve, but the argument was tax cuts would so much generate economic activity, they would pay for themselves. And you still hear residues of that kind of thinking from Jack Mintz from the Calgary School, from others who sit on boards of big corporations. That whenever you hear, I don't want to tax the job creators, it's kind of a residue of that same argument. You know who the job creators are, right? Consumers, workers, the people who buy services, the people who work. And But the so-called job creators, the rich, this notion that somehow if you tax them, you'll burn the economy, and if you cut taxes, you know Canada has the lowest corporate taxes, not just Alberta. Canada has the lowest cumulative corporate taxes in the G7. Did you know that? And do you know what those taxes, we are lagging in corporate investment. Corporations are sitting on $700 billion of idle cash. They are not building the new jobs. Profit is soaring as a portion of GDP. Idle cash is soaring, but there are no jobs being produced. We've been sold a bill of goods. But and by the way, the biggest deficit, the most enormous deficit was created by Ronald Reagan, the great proponent that tax cuts would be a free good. The huge, embarrassing, insane rise in debt and deficits put a lie. Here, take this as gospel. You can, whoever argues the contrary, you can say with absolute certainty, tax cuts have never paid for themselves. Not ever. Not anywhere. Not never. And they never will. There's not an instance. In fact, economists have stopped making that case because it's so foolish. And now the case they're more likely to make is, you know how we're going to cut taxes without cutting your services? We are going to cut waste and inefficiency in government. Waste and inefficiency, that's it. All it takes to pay for these tax cuts is to bring government to heel, to take on government. We don't even say government anymore, do we? We say bloated bureaucracy. We got to take in fact, I believe there's a federal law that says you cannot say the word bureaucracy if it's not preceded by the word bloated. So, and the unbelievable success of the right, the great success of the right, is that they have, in the minds of many Canadians, equated government with inefficiency and corruption, and made us think that taxes are a burden to be relieved from and a constraint on our freedom. That's the success of the right, and we have to take it on. We know that governments do waste money. Private sector wastes money. Everybody wastes money. And we know that good governments try to reduce waste. We also know that there's always room for greater efficiency. But at the federal level, for example, parliamentary budget officer after parliamentary budget officer have shown us the numbers never add up. There's never as much waste as we think. There's never, of course we should be angry at waste. Of course we should demand the best of our governments. Of course we should demand greater transparency. But the numbers never add up. There's never enough waste to fund the tax cuts. Organizations like the Fraser Institute and the Taxpayers Federation are constantly amplifying every example of waste. So the Fraser Institute just last year published, I don't even remember the numbers, so I'll make them up. They published a report that said something like $1 quadrillion over 10 years has been wasted by governments. If you looked at the footnotes of the report, they added everything. They added accounting errors. They also showed you with absolute certainty that if you take a number and multiply it by 10, it's much higher. But independent studies of government waste and efficiency have said, of course, there's room to improve, but you know, you want real waste, look at private-public partnerships. In the last audit, we're talking about, of Ontario, we're talking about billions of dollars down. You want waste, build profit into public service. Because you want waste, look at what privatization does, so that quality of service goes down and our dependency on corporate profit-driven motives goes up. It hasn't worked anywhere yet. We continue to support it. You want waste, look at our failures to regulate the market in terms of the public interest. Look at 2008. You want waste, look at how much wealth was lost because government wasn't strong enough to regulate and to oversee their regulations. You want waste, look at the consequences of food processes gone bad. Look at the consequences of failures of rail safety. Look at the consequence. The list is, and you want waste. Government's not the first place to look. And yes, good government, we should demand good government, but never buy the notion that you can cut taxes by killing the gravy train. They never find the gravy, or there's not enough gravy to go around. And you know, all of us are appalled by the $17 glass of orange juice or the horrible stuff we're hearing about the Senate. But those numbers are a small portion of the total budget. They're horrible, but they're a small percentage. And we allow the media and institutes like Fraser, which, by the way, is a charitable organization, which you fund with your tax dollars. You want waste. In any case, can I do quite? I don't know how much time. I'm supposed to finish by 11 o'clock tonight. So, but if you, do I have that right, Gil? Oh, I've got 9 seconds, but but let me take 4 of those 9 seconds to do a square bracket on the Fraser Institute. One of the favorite targets, obviously, of people who sell the austerity mess is public service wages and pensions. So and it's very effective to divide unionized from non-unionized, public from private. And that divide has had huge negative consequences for Canada. And the Fraser Institute recently published a report, just much like the false data you have on Alberta's wage bill, that says public servants are way overpaid compared to their private sector counterparts. Well, there are a couple of things I should say about that. Number one, it's just bullshit. It's just absolutely not true. And number two, it's just bullshit. But I don't know if you have it in Alberta, but Ontario has a sunshine list where they publish the salaries of public servants who make $100,000 or more. And there's quite a few of them, not as many as there should be, but quite a few of them. And that's always an opportunity for the Fraser Institute to poke fun at public sector wages. And so they took advantage of it. Well, this time an Ottawa blogger asked the Fraser Institute, under Access, asked the Fraser Institute, because they're a charitable organization, how many of their people get $100,000 or more? Do you know about this story? So they answered, and they said, well, you know, all our executive and almost all of our economists get over $100,000, but we have to do that. We're competing for the best talent. We have to have the very best talent. Okay. I want the very best talent taking care of my hospitals. I want the best talent taking care of my kids. So let's all buy the Fraser Institute argument. We need to raise public sector wages because we need the best talent for our kids, for our patients when we're ill, to negotiate trade deals, to ensure our infrastructure is in shape, to make sure the water's clean when it comes out of the tap. We need to pour money into our public servants because we are competing for the very best. And where do you want the very best? In those places where health, safety, and the future of your kids resides. Fraser Institute. Okay, so we've had, now, this neoliberal market fundamentalism was actually a harder sell in Canada, except maybe in Alberta. It was a harder sell for most of Canada because we were much more friendly to government, and we were much more wedded to our public services. For example, we had Medicare, and we care about Medicare. And when premiers of Alberta tried to meddle with Medicare, add fees, it was Albertans, not Ottawa, that stopped them. So we cared about these things. But don't mistake for a moment that neoliberalism hasn't arrived in Canada. Just last year, for example, the size of the federal government as a portion of our economy hit the same size as the US federal government as a portion of their economy. We are no longer public enterprise Canada. Just taking the figures in the federal budget, the projection of taxes as a portion of the economy and expenditures, federal expenditures as a portion of the economy, we are going to be lower than we've been for 70 years. That's lower than we've been since before we had Medicare, before we had Canada Pension Plan, before we had Canada-wide welfare systems, and before we had mass education. Think about it. So, of course, tax cuts have a consequence. And what is that consequence? That consequence, in a word, is austerity. And Canadian austerity is unique in two ways. It's unique because, unlike Europe, our fiscal situation is really good. So we do austerity in slow motion. And austerity in slow motion is actually scarier than the kind of stuff you see in Spain and Greece. It's because it's harder to rally opposition. But we need to oppose this because and I'll talk about why, but the consequences are real and they're enduring. So one reason that austerity is different in Canada is that it's in slow motion. A second reason is it's self-imposed. We have austerity because we cut taxes irresponsibly. And because we chose austerity, that means we could choose an alternative. You know, every single time an austerity politician talks to us about austerity, they say what? There is no alternative. We cannot afford what we've built. There is no alternative. Well, here's Himelfarb's golden rule. When a politician tells you there is no alternative, be certain that there is one, and you'd like it a whole lot more if it were enough. So very briefly, and I'll try to, it's not my strength to be very brief, but I will try to be, in the next 2.5 seconds I have, I will try to be very brief about quickly the consequences of austerity, and I will go through them like a machine. Number one, austerity breeds a cycle of erosion and distrust. Now, how does this work? You cut taxes, and then you say, oh, we can't afford the programs we have. Then you cut frontline workers, and the services actually erode. The clients of those services get mad. They say, see, government doesn't work. And you say, yeah, so let's cut taxes. So how does it go? Cut taxes, erode services, erode trust, cut taxes, repeat. It's called, in Republican US, it's called starve the beast. You starve the beast, you starve Canada Post, you starve CBCs, you starve Canada Post, even though it's a profit-making organization, you starve Canada Post. Then you'd say, okay, we're going to raise the cost of stamps, and we're going to end home delivery. We're going to make you pay more user fees for less service. And then people say, I don't like Canada Post. Hello. Starve the beast. You squeeze CBC so much that they haven't got one program you watch, and then they say, why don't we kill it? Do you know how many what percentage of unemployed people have access to unemployment insurance or employment insurance? Do you have a guess? What proportion? It's in big cities like Toronto, it's less than 20%. Nationally, it's between 30 and 40%. And so we have squeezed employment insurance so much that it doesn't work. And so what does the Taxpayer Federation say? Let's kill it. You know, we've made it sick, now let's put it out of our misery. That's what austerity does. It creates this erosion of services and distrust of government, and that feeds the tax cut frenzy. So people say, if government doesn't work, why would I pay taxes? So I have this image, of somebody in Toronto in gridlock, in traffic jam, 3 hours trying to get home to their suburbs, to their kids, their spouse, because we haven't invested in 20 years in infrastructure. We haven't invested in transportation, in green transportation. So nothing works in Toronto. You cannot go anywhere in Toronto. You go to Toronto and stay where you are and then leave. That's how it works. So I can see this person in traffic gridlock saying, oh God, I hate government. I'm never paying my taxes. Well, that's how you got in gridlock, man. That's the process of erosion and distrust. The second consequence is what I have called in other speeches trickle-down meanness. You know, this market fundamentalism is often referred to as trickle-down economics. I'll tell you what trickles down: meanness. We become more mean. Who are the first victims? Who are the first victims of austerity? The most vulnerable. Migrant workers who aren't even able to pull out benefits and systems they pay into. And they're used to push your wages down, a double exploitation. We exploit them to exploit you. It's like a win-win. Who else? Refugees. I'm a refugee. When I was one, I brought my parents to Canada because I saw this as where the future was. And so I'm a refugee. I'm particularly sensitive to this. We cut access to health benefits, necessary medical treatment for refugee claimants. What the fuck is that? Prisoners make meager wages building furniture, truly meager wages building furniture that might help them reintegrate as law-abiding citizens, tax-paying citizens. We cut those wages and we increase the fees they pay for phone calls. What are we doing? The unemployed, kids, we're moving backwards on child poverty. Trickle-down meanness. Or to put it simply, austerity feeds inequality. And when inequality is heightened, when you have extreme inequality, it's corrosive. It's corrosive. The people at the top come to believe they deserve everything they have. They can effectively secede from society. They don't need these public services. They want their tax cuts. They don't think they should pay tax. They deserve everything they have. And the people at the bottom say, well, the game's rigged. I have no chance. Why would I pay taxes? Why would I even vote? Extreme inequality feeds the tax cut frenzy. And we're not going to solve anything if we don't make inequality our first item of business. But of course, we all pay a price. We all lose our humanity if we ignore poverty and if we ignore inequality. But we also become more directly poorer. You know, the family that embraces income splitting and the latest tax cut doesn't get anything for it when they have to pay $1,500 a month for childcare. They're much more served by good public, do we really need more shopping or do we need more public welfare? And the last consequence I'll talk about of austerity is we start to lose our belief that we can make things better together. We start to lose hope. We start to lose a belief in collective progress. We start to believe that government's not capable of anything and we're on our own. You know, when Thatcher said there is no such thing as society, how many of you remember that? The Canadian equivalent is thou shalt not commit sociology, but in any case, when Thatcher said there is no such thing as society, what she said was, if people look to society for explanations, that becomes excuses. It justifies their failure. It makes them less ambitious. And if they look to government for handouts, it makes them less industrious. And so, frankly, they should look to each other, their family, and their neighbors, and stop looking at society and stop looking at government. And people have, and there's something really seductive about the language of self-reliance. There's something really seductive about take responsibility for yourselves. And people herald this as a triumph of freedom and individualism. Well, it's the exact opposite. It's destructive of freedom and individualism. It ignores the role that bad luck and a bad starting place if you're born to the wrong family or unequal power has on our lives. It ignores the role government plays in giving people the tools to be empowered, to be free, to be individuals, to be authentic. It is, at its worst, an excuse and a justification for selfishness and greed. And we have to say no to selfishness and greed. And while they talk about freedom, we have to say no. We're talking about power and the extent that the concentration of power deprives all of us of freedom. So it is time for us to take back the language. Yes, we believe in freedom, and we believe that everybody's freedom matters, not just the powerful few. And yes, we are ready to take back the future, and we know that we'll get the future we're willing to pay for. Fairness is an easy political sell, and when we hear politicians that say you can't sell taxes, I always tell them you can sell fairness. And so I come back to the beginning. I think the change will start in Alberta, and I think it will start in this kind of room, and maybe even in this room.